Good afternoon, all. I suggest we get started. My name is Frans Melissen, and on behalf of my co-moderator Lars Maratas, I would like to welcome everyone to this session. Great to see that so many of you are joining us for this second session in the Principles of Responsible Management Education Academy seminar series. I won't say that again, that's too many words. We promised Mette Morsing to say hi to you all as well, since she's not able to join us today. For those of you who did not participate in the first session of this series of 4, the aim of this series is to offer some cutting-edge scholarly and practitioner insights on responsible management education from a variety of perspectives. And as you may have read, you are encouraged to ask questions to the speakers and, for instance, challenge them by taking a provocative stance towards their ideas and contentions. I'm sure that Dara and Jordyn will be okay with that, but we do ask you to do that through using the chat, please. So if you could all mute yourself and then type your questions in the chat, Lars and I will make sure that your question ends up at Jordyn and Dara. Today we welcome Dara Kelly and Jordyn Hrenyk as our speakers on the topic of decolonizing the business school and its implications for principles of responsible management education. Dara Kelly is an assistant professor of Indigenous Business at the Beedie School of Business of Simon Fraser University. And Dara holds a doctorate of philosophy in management from the University of Auckland Business School. She teaches in the Executive MBA in Indigenous Business and Leadership and on Indigenous business environments within full-time and part-time MBA programs. And in her work, she challenges conventional economical practices and informs positive change by drawing on knowledge of Indigenous economics. She's also the co-chair of Indigenous Caucus at the Academy of Management and serves on the board of the Association for Economic Research of Indigenous People. And Jordyn Hrenyk is a PhD student of Business Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Beedie School of Business. Her research is focused on strategic entrepreneurship in non-typical or marginalized business settings, such as Indigenous-owned businesses, stigmatized industries and cooperatives. And she's particularly interested in how entrepreneurs who either find themselves in or who choose to work in the margins of the mainstream market find and serve their customers while meeting their own goals, objectives, and conceptions of success. Welcome to you, Dara and Jordyn. We are very happy to have you on this second session on such an important topic. And for the flow of the session today, Dara and Jordyn will kick off by presenting the topic and their work to you, and they will also share their screen with us to do so. And then after that, Lars and I will start a conversation with them and further explore the implications for responsible management education of their presentation. And if you have any questions, as I said earlier, please go ahead and type them in the chat, and then we'll make sure that we'll address them to Dara and Jordyn. So, Dara and Jordyn, the digital floor is yours.
Great, I'll just share my screen here. And I'll let Dara kick us off.
Okay, excuse me. Thanks, Jordyn. So I'd like to introduce myself in my language, which is called the Halkomelem language. Eight swale is good day. Ami kwitwila makwat, talitl lakamo, talitl kwate alice, Dara Kelly til squeak, quickly has til squeak. So I just wanted to welcome everyone and I come from the Lekamel First Nation. I also come from the Tsayalis people. This is part of the larger Coast Salish tribes, which are just outside the city of Vancouver. And I am an assistant professor at the Beedie School of Business. And I've been at the business school for about 3 years. And prior to that, I studied at the University of Auckland. So it's been a really exciting journey. And today I'm going to be speaking about the kind of first work that I've been doing at the business school. Just getting a lay of the land, and Jordyn and I are going to frame the session first with some key concepts, and we've got some key assumptions as well that we'll be operating off of. And so these will be on our slides, but this is just helping to frame up a little bit of the conversation. So I'll let Jordyn introduce herself.
Anchikia. Hello, everyone. As you know, my name is Jordyn Hrenyk. I'm a Michif or Métis researcher from the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. I'm also a PhD candidate at the Beedie School of Business. So while I come from my community's home territory in the prairies of Canada, or what's called Treaty 6 territory, I now, of course, live on the West Coast in Vancouver, which is a city built on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, which is where I am this morning. So at Beedie, I work with two supervisors. One is Dara Kelly, who's obviously here with us today, and the other is Dr. Stephanie Bertels, who's a scholar of sustainable business and organizational change. So I'm very fortunate to work with two scholars really focused on this area that we're talking about today. My own research is, as was mentioned, focused on Indigenous entrepreneurship, particularly traditions. So I've studied, for example, how Indigenous restaurant owners convey authenticity through their products to customers who are not really well informed about those products. So how they kind of bridge those communications gaps or those knowledge gaps. I'm currently working on my dissertation, and my dissertation is focused on the economic and cultural practices of Indigenous artisans, specifically beaders who make and sell work online, such as jewelry, accessories, clothing, and regalia, using traditional and contemporary practices and materials. So that's kind of the lens that I bring to this work. I'm really happy to be joining you all this early morning here from Vancouver. Really excited to engage with you, particularly in the question and answer period at the end of our talk today. As Dara and I will get into, decolonizing the business school is not just something that she and I care about as individual scholars. It's something that we don't have a choice but to participate in or to engage in as Indigenous business scholars. So, like I said, I'm really excited to talk to you all about your ideas about how we can kind of move these processes forward together in our various places of work and study. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Dara.
Great, thank you. So one of the things to sort of set us up as well was an article that Jordyn and I wrote for the conversation. And we wrote this article in October. It's called A Call to Decolonize Business Schools, Including Our Own. And we responded to a lot of the activity that was unfolding around the world, also with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement. And this article is about, you know, what is the role that we play as educators, as also contributing to exacerbating some of the problems that take place. Now, I'm not that far out from finishing my PhD myself, so I also speak sort of from that perspective, as from a student perspective of studying in business schools for over a decade, and feeling that while the education I received was amazing and I found incredible mentors, there were moments in the in the courses and in the coursework where I really felt that my identity was not reflected in the content and the theories and the methodologies that were being presented to us within sort of that frame, or that larger framework of the accreditation standards, the AASCSB, the EQUIS standards, that what is required of business schools is actually, it didn't need to respond to diversity of students in the classroom necessarily. And so this was a challenging experience as well. So our first sort of assumption that we put forward is that decolonization isn't going to happen right away. It's not going to happen on the first try, and that's fine. And I think that that's sort of what we hope you will get out of this session, is the idea that what's most important is that a start happens, and we're anticipating that this is going to be a long journey, that both my career and Jordyn's career are the starting places for being able to express and bring Indigenous knowledge into our teaching practices, and that we do that not for just institutional transformation purposes, but actually we do that because we're making an effort to actually see ourselves within the larger content, and that recognizing much of our student body is also feeling the same way. We've got an Executive MBA program in Indigenous Business and Leadership at the Beedie School. So we've got a cohort of Indigenous students who come through our classrooms every year, and it's important for us to build content and pedagogy that reflects the realities of those communities. The second assumption is also recognizing that that the Indigenous experience is something that doesn't necessarily fit within any one of the principles. And so we see this, we were talking a lot as we were preparing about Principle 5, and how Principle 5 is talking about, the building relationships. And we thought, but it's not just about building relationships. We've got the Indigenous experience extends across all six principles. And our third assumption is also that we also don't want to build our pedagogies and teaching practices around discourses of scarcity. So it's often easy to kind of say, we've got a whole set of problems, or we've got all of these things that we need to solve, or we've got deficiencies or gaps. All of that is language of scarcity. And yet what both Jordyn and I feel and experience is that actually what we're trying to do, and what we're trying to offer within this educational space, is a language of abundance. That there is so much within Indigenous communities. There's so much knowledge that is absolutely beautiful, and it comes from an entirely different way of situating oneself in the world. And that from that place of abundance, and from the place of kind of beauty and ethics and love and wonderful principles that are built into Indigenous knowledges, that's our starting place, and that's what we can begin to bring into the classroom. So we also have some key concepts that we feel are pretty important moving forward into this conversation, and these are just some words that we use interchangeably in some circumstances, but also mean very different things in different contexts. So I often use the word unlearning. So unlearning is important because, as I just said, we're talking about different sets of knowledge and different worldviews. And I often ask students within actually both Indigenous and non-Indigenous classrooms that, you know, the knowledge that I present from my community and the knowledge that I present from a research perspective often because it comes from a different worldview, it may not align with many of the assumptions that we have sort of built in as our dominant assumptions. And so in order to make some space for Indigenous knowledges to grow and thrive and to begin to offer something different, I ask students for the opportunity to unlearn. So I sort of present it and say, here's an opportunity for us in the classroom to do this work together. And that seeking consent from students is actually hugely important, because if I try and, force this knowledge into somebody else's reality, it's something that's often uncomfortable, and it really challenges what the students know. So this unlearning process is really important. It sort of sets the stage for being able to have a great dialogue as well. So the word decolonization itself, it's one of the great articles that that talks about this is actually the authors who are in the unlearning quote here, Adam Gaudry and Lorenz from 2018. This is an article where they talk about the differences between decolonization and indigenization. And I think that they work together. So we can think about decolonization as the process of sort of challenging and critiquing, and sometimes pulling apart and taking, dismantling, disrupting, and sort of destabilizing what it is we think we know, or the systems, and really challenging some of that. The indigenization process is more along the lines of, you're bringing Indigenous knowledges into a space. So this process of unlearning is this decolonization and indigenization as a partnership. These two concepts need to work together. And the word reconciliation is, it's used in a lot of different contexts, but in Canada, we've had a series of royal commissions and reports that are coming out of really coming to terms with our colonial history. And the most recent was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. This is, so, in Canada, we call this the TRC, and it's often built now into some institutional language, especially at the higher university level. You'll see it in our institutional documents at SFU, talks about the role of reconciliation. This is quite specific to this moment in time with regards to the TRC, but it's important also to recognize, there was a report in 1996 called the RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and much of that report, although it wasn't specifically focused on the education and the residential school process, it brought up many of these same issues. And so it kind of is a, it's about, I think what's happening is a generational sort of forgetting and remembering process. From 1996 to 2015, you've got this time gap, and things sort of start to slip. So yeah, and this reconciliation process has faced a lot of critique from Indigenous communities because of that sort of institutional national forgetting, which can be very frustrating for Indigenous peoples, because we sort of feel like, well, we've been through this many times before, not only through the process of colonization, but now we've got these, well-intentioned reports and well-intentioned efforts. They're informing institutional practices, and yet it seems like we constantly have to remind the world that we've been colonized in Canada, and that as Indigenous peoples, this has been a hugely painful process. So I think, this is some of the institutional language that comes into this conversation as well. So I'm going to turn to Jordyn now.
Sure. So I can speak to kind of the role of the business school in these processes of colonization and recolonization. I think a lot of us are familiar with these ideas, which is why we're at this session today. The business school participates and perpetuates systems of unfairness, such as capitalism and colonialism, patriarchy. The business school is part of a university which contributes to these systems as well. The business school has an opportunity to teach students differently, especially in relation to capitalist systems. So I want to not dwell on those issues too much. We know a lot about them. We know a lot about those problems. I want to turn our conversation today to how we make adjustments, how we decolonize. Because we do believe we can decolonize, we do believe we can make change within our institutions. And Dara and I have talked, I've talked with many different kinds of audiences about decolonizing the business school. Some are more invested in these processes of change than others. Some are invested only in name only. And some are really, really kind of co-conspirators in this process. But no matter the audience, I've noticed a kind of base level of pessimism about how much change and how fast these institutions can change. Some individuals feel very discouraged. They feel that meaningful change can't come within our current systems, or that it can't come from a conservative institution like a business school. Some individuals are well-intentioned, but don't feel that they have the agency to contribute to positive change, or don't know how to contribute to positive change. So I want to kind of frame this part of our discussion to push back on that pessimism with the idea of investing in failures. So I was actually introduced to the idea of investing in failures, or the importance of investing in failures, from a professor, a marketing professor by the name of Dr. Ed O'Brien at University of Chicago, who's working on a project called The Hidden Value of Relative Progress. In this kind of research stream, researchers are looking at how progress is perceived by external audiences, and how their perceptions impact their willingness to support change agents. So essentially, these audiences feel that they are apart from a societal problem, therefore apart from its solution. And they focus a lot on climate change, but I think it's also applicable to the issue of decolonizing the business school, where many well-intentioned students and professors might be interested in this topic, but feel that they are not part of the problem, therefore not part of the solution. And they really research how these kind of big, ambiguous, and entrenched problems cause these audiences to feel disheartened when efforts to solve the problem fall short of some overarching goal. So one example we can look at within the Canadian context is, for example, when a prominent artist or filmmaker or scholar who has presented themselves as Indigenous is actually found out to be lying about that identity. And these kinds of incidents are really damaging to Indigenous individuals, but they're also damaging to movements, to larger movements for Indigenous sovereignty and decolonization, because it causes external audiences to metaphorically throw their hands up and say, this is too complicated, Indigenous identity is too complicated, so I'll just stay out of it. When we face setbacks, or when we are facing a bunch of very, very small wins that are not maybe easily perceptible to these audiences, that's actually needs to be our motivation to re-engage or doubly engage in the process. it needs to be our motivation to reinvest in those failures. Because if we don't reinvest, those audiences might just throw their hands up and say, we don't know how to do this. That's the time when change agents need to double their efforts to motivate greater investment and greater engagement. We also need to learn to celebrate real progress where it occurs. We need to recognize when real change happens, not window dressing, not small tweaks around the edges, but there has been incremental progress in particularly indigenization in universities in Canada and around the world. And we need to be able to celebrate those honestly without overblowing them or tokenizing the people involved in those successes. So I believe in incremental change. I study entrepreneurship and innovation, and I know that incremental changes can lead to systemic change. There are some scholars who would disagree with me about seeking to implement incremental change because they believe incremental change may act as a pressure valve that prevents more fundamental change from rising. But with incremental change that is sustained, we can get to the systemic change that we need, and students really need that change right now. So I want to talk a little bit about our roles as individuals in this very big, ambiguous process. And Indigenous ontologies and methodologies really teach us that knowing and doing is contextual. Knowing and doing in one institution does not mean you know how to do those same processes in another institution. So I think one of the most obvious and important places to start decolonizing your institution is to start with self-location. Know, for example, whose land you're on, if you're in a settler society. Know your country's history and how it's intertwined with the histories of colonialism and slavery. You have agency in the institutions and you can drive change. We see that in our own areas of research like institutional entrepreneurship. And coming to discover how your own histories are intertwined with slavery and colonization can lead to discomfort or denial or anger. Same with that of your students if you're teaching a decolonial studies. But what you or what your students do with those feelings really help to determine whether you become a change agent or whether you turn away. And as I mentioned, this is where we as business scholars really can look to our own scholarship to understand how to change our institutions. Organizational theorists study how social movements grow. Strategy scholars study how brokers create aligned incentives to push for change. Leadership scholars study how charismatic leaders bring change to entrenched organizations. We can and should look to our own scholarship to learn how to create kind of decolonial ripples within our institutions. One concrete suggestion that Dara, myself, and a group at Beedie received from an expert in this area is just to start a circle at your institution. Start a circle about decolonizing your school and invite other scholars and students to join you and start to have those conversations openly. Find out where you are personally in your own decolonial journey, find out where your school's at, and look to find ways to push both of those needles forward. It's a small action, but it can be part of other goals that your institution is already committed to, such as the 6 principles. Aligning the goals of your institution with the goals of decolonization is one way to move this forward, even in the most entrenched institutions. So in thinking about where we want to go, I want to return to this idea of abundance. And I want to invite you to think about the abundant futures that Indigenous students and communities really deserve from our schools. I offer 3 ideas, my ideas about where I'd like to see business schools like mine go, but my ideas don't have to be yours, and obviously everyone's institution is starting at a different place. So first, I hope to see business schools that are leading the discussions on alternative economic futures. There's some scholars who work in this area exclusively. Paul Adler has done some really good work with this. Dara's dissertation, for example, was an articulation of post-Salish economies of affection. And other scholars bring in things like cooperative business models and really focus on those alternative business models in their courses. But business schools are behind the market on this. We're continuing to teach profit maximizing philosophies when most students come into our schools wanting to learn a better way of doing business. You know, what was social entrepreneurship is just becoming entrepreneurship. And I think business schools need to lead and not follow those discussions. Next, Indigenous ontologies and ways of being have so much to offer, you know, not just the business school, but all of academia. But our work is very consistently downplayed or overlooked or invalidated within our own schools. What we teach in one course might be contradicted very obviously in the next. And taking Indigenous scholarship and ontology seriously is required to decolonize and to indigenize. And that's something that all scholars, Indigenous or not, can engage in. Indigenous methodologies and research, you know, is a fulsome area, and you can turn to Indigenous scholars in whatever course you're teaching. Finally, what I want to think about and what I think is most urgent for universities to take as a step is practicing scholarship that really refills communities rather than extracts from them. So white scholarship has always been extractive. It's always been about taking knowledge or value from communities and concentrating that knowledge among scholars, sharing that knowledge with each other within the ivory tower. But Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous ways of being offer us other pathways. They offer us pathways towards conducting work as scholars that gives rather than takes. And I think it's time that we as business scholars and as business institutions follow those pathways laid out for us. We say in the conversation piece that there are other faculties that are further along than the business school in this, and we can follow their lead. We can turn to other faculties within our own institutions to see how they're doing this work. One thing I want to stress is that we don't need to recreate the process of decolonization. There are many experts that we can turn to learn how to do these things, and your institution has these experts, whether it's in your own school, students, professors, or even staff can be brought and need to be brought into these conversations so you can learn what's best for your institutions. So I think we can leave it there. I just want to thank so much on behalf of Dara and I to Lars and Franz and Sophie and all the other organizers today. We're really happy to engage with you and engage with your questions. Hopefully build a discussion that can outlast this session today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dara and Jordyn. So first of all, this strikes a chord with me for sure, and I guess there's a lot to discuss from a lot of perspectives. So, for instance, the business school as an institution, right? Its responsibilities in society, its relationship with stakeholders, but also the management education curriculum itself and the role of management educators, of course. And what I also find particularly interesting is how change happens, especially the point that you make about incremental change. The reason why it strikes a chord with me is, well, it's an agenda of justice, it's an agenda of voice, it's an agenda of inclusion, right, that we're talking about here. And I came across also in preparing this session, I came across an article that contained the following quote from Arundhati Roy, and that basically said, there are no voiceless, only the deliberately silenced and the purposely unheard, which I found pretty interesting. And what I also see, what I also feel with myself by kind of taking this lens, right, if I may, taking decolonizing and indigenizing as a lens, I mean, you start to see all types of power struggles, right, and the importance of vested interests and how new ideas surface or why new ideas won't surface, right, or don't take root, for example. So just as I take the liberty to pose a first question, and how can we prevent, also given, let's say, your theory of change, right, when you focus on the importance of incremental change, how can we prevent, as management educators, as business schools, right, also as a community of management education, how can we prevent more tokenistic or superficial initiatives? What would be your reflection on that?
I can start. I'm sure Dara will have thoughts on this as well, but I think tokenistic initiatives is mostly what we've seen from business schools so far. Part of that stems from this being so new a conversation in the business school, despite being an old conversation in many other areas of the university. But as far as how we prevent it, I think that there's two things I'd like to see. One, more like indigenization, more Indigenous people in the institutions in a safe way, more Indigenous scholarship in the institutions and having that scholarship taken seriously. When we see indigenization efforts so far, it is very superficial. Sometimes professors will ask to bring an elder in for a welcome at the start of their course, which is great, but that gets left at the start of the course and isn't carried through the rest of the course. So I think the thing we need to do is to invest in learning opportunities for the people in power. And in this case, many of the professors are the people in power. They have the opportunity to infuse Indigenous scholarship into the courses that they're already teaching. So I think it starts with people in power in these institutions taking their own decolonial journey very seriously before they start trying to teach or trying to preach it. Understanding where you are and understanding where your own learning is a very, very important first step, and pushing yourself to know more and to do more. So I think instead of asking Indigenous people, there's very few of us in business school, instead of asking us to do this work, having scholars willing to address that fear of being wrong, or address that fear of not being an expert, and actually being humble enough to realize they need to do the learning themselves is somewhere we need to start. But I'm sure Dara has other thoughts.
Do you, Dara?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's I shake my head because it's a very fine line to walk, because my experience of being an Indigenous professor, I mean, first of all, the Indigenous professor title is, it sort of is almost driving at the heart of this, is the fact that Beedie was seeking somebody who can not advise the school, but bring in this knowledge. And I feel like I'm always, I wonder sometimes if it's a tokenistic thing, but then I have good relationships with some very supportive people within the business school, and those are the signals to me that it's not a tokenized relationship. Cat.
We have the cat, yes.
We do have the cat. Yeah. So and I think it would feel tokenistic if I was just brought into conversations that were very transactional. So, if the business school is needing to make a decision on something, and then they bring me in because it has to do with our Indigenous programs, but that's the only time that I get brought in, which is hard, because it means I end up having to be a spokesperson. It means it takes me away from my research. It means that there's all kinds of implications that that actually don't fall on other junior scholars the same way, right? So it's this, and I think that this experience is common not just for Indigenous faculty, but marginalized populations and women and BIPOC folks. It's yeah, but it's hard because you're kind of I've explained actually to one of our associate deans, if it seems like if it seems like you're grappling with a paradox with my position and my role, because you're asking me to advise on quite high level governance and leadership decisions and conversations, but at the same time, you're needing to manage my time and say, you know, we can't ask too much of Dara, and we can't rely over like too much on what Dara's insights are. That's the paradox, is that I'm a junior scholar, but I'm also an Indigenous scholar, and being the only faculty member in the business school makes it very hard to actually meet both of those criteria. I can't, you know, so that's, yeah, I don't know if that's a tokenized conversation, but it's a tough spot to be sometimes.
Yeah, I understand. I'm also looking at the chat for some additional questions. And one question is from Heather, and she's asking, I think there's a fear among non-Indigenous scholars and professors that we might get it wrong, right? So how do we get past that to start? It also relates to something that I've come across together with Frans, by the way. One of our concepts actually is what we've come to call sustainability intelligence, right? And sustainability intelligence we dissect this into 3 types of intelligence, which is naive, native, and narrative intelligence. And not that long ago, actually, I got a response for somebody who read through this idea and responded to this idea of native intelligence and kind of accused us of some cultural appropriation, right? In that sense. So I think the question that Heather poses is also interesting, because people might also be hesitant within the business schools, right? Because they think they get it wrong, right? Is that something that you recognize, or what would be the suggestion for this?
Well, it's a hard thing to ask me, because often I'm not the person who hears about those. I'm not the person that people come to, right? Because I'm the person that is feared, and I hate to say it like that, but it's actually it's hard, because it's not me, it's what I represent, right? It's the fact that I represent a sense of either not knowing what Indigenous knowledge is or how it works, and also, by the way, Heather, I think this is Heather from Gustafson Business School, and so we actually work together on many occasions. But I also, yeah, like I'm not the person people come to. It's like people will talk to each other outside of my circles, and that's where the fear is manifested, because actually people aren't talking to me, and it's disappointing, because that process is actually quite dehumanizing, right? To find that you are the person who represents change, and change is scary, and therefore you're a scary person. Like, for that to be the nature of a collegial relationship, is not a good starting place. And so I think, like, if I was to think about the dehumanizing process there, the opposite then is a humanizing process. If the fear is there, it probably means you need to move forward into that. It probably means you need to move towards that person, not away from that person, because fear is going to just become a barrier that will become insurmountable then, because you're never going to be able to interface with what it actually represents.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
if I could just add to that a little. I think the fear is, not to sound like a broken record, but it's partially a fear of not being an expert. You know, professors are used to being the smartest person in the room. They're used to having the answers to the questions. And I think it can be very destabilizing for some people to realize that they don't know everything, or that they are being asked to engage in a conversation that feels new to them. So I think, you know, self-preparation is how you move past that fear. Recognizing with humility that you don't know everything, and that's okay. You can learn, and you should learn, and we should expect scholars to learn about these things that fear, I think, yeah, is understandable. People aren't used to not being experts. They're not used to having to change. They're not used to having to adjust their perspectives in such a radical way. But the only way to move forward is to do that learning with humility, either on your own or lean on the people around you. Like I said, start a circle, start conversations, start readings. That's how you can demystify this, because it's not such a complicated process when you look at it.
Yeah, I think this directly relates to the question that Lauren poses, right? And she says, I understand decolonizing university also as a possibility to confront the traditional teacher-student hierarchy by placing the student central and allowing them to design and guide into their own learning, right? So it's kind of, in a sense, flipping the classroom 2.0, right? In a sense. So what are your views on this?
I'm the student here. I can start, I guess. I would say I'd be careful with that idea of specifically to Indigenous students. Don't ask them to teach your class, which does happen. Don't ask them to be, like Dara said, the representative for Indigenous people, or to bring, to indigenize your course for you. That's work that, first of all, should be paid. And that's, but I do hear what they're saying about breaking down kind of the barriers between the student and teacher relationship, and getting to know your students a little bit more as people, and facilitating the students getting to know themselves, I think can be very important parts of this. Some of these conversations are going to be difficult for students to confront as well. So if they have other students in their course to talk through these issues with, I think that's very important. But yeah, I would not ask students to do the teaching for you.
I mean, I sort of see this question from moving away from that banking model of education, of just, sort of conveying information that goes inside people's brains and they spit it back out, and that's supposed to be learning. I think it can be so much more engaged, and yeah, like when I did a session last week also on, pedagogy in the classroom, and I think for me, because I am Indigenous, I do a lot of code switching. So depending on who the student body is, when I'm teaching with Indigenous students, there's a shared experience there, right? So they may come from different nations than my nation, but when I talk to them, there's a shared colonial experience. So I don't need to explain a lot of, things there. But it's actually sometimes can be a harder audience for me, because they bring the same Indigenous perspective into that classroom at that sort of national historical level. And so my job then is to invite them to bring their Indigenous knowledge into the classroom, to say, okay, like what's happening in your community that we can tackle, that we can actually, if it's a leadership course, talk about, and this is where I often bring in, all kinds of theory. I was teaching on Keith Grint's Wicked Problems, because often what we see in Indigenous communities is, a lot of different versions of wicked problems. These problems seem like they have absolutely no way out. And so this framework is helpful, it's useful to bring that in. But when I teach with non-Indigenous students, then my job is to bring as much Indigenous content into that classroom as possible through guest speakers, through, activities and materials and stuff like that. So yeah, I kind of pull on Indigenous knowledge in a non-Indigenous classroom, and the opposite. I sort of jockey when
exactly.
I need to. Yeah.
It also links to the question that Emmanuel posed, right? What's the kind of activities that you're using with the students? So there's a saying, right, that the best teachers don't tell you what to see, but show you where to look, right? So what are the places that you invite them to look then, also beyond the classroom?
Well, one of the ideas that I've had recently is what I would love to do is teach our Indigenous leadership course within one of our ceremonial longhouses. In Vancouver, this is, this is great because we have access to some of these communities. Now, if we just sort of, the very obviously is the pandemic at the moment, but if we put that aside and just say, okay, what's possible if we were allowed to gather in those places, how does that shift and change a leadership conversation? Well, one of the first things is, that's our relationship with communities. So if, again, I mentioned principle 5 at the beginning, that if we think about, so partnership, we interact with managers, business corporations. So it's about building that partnership. But I often think, well, what are we doing at Beedie to really take those relationships seriously? And if we bring our classrooms onto the lands and territories, that allows us to not just talk about Indigenous principles of leadership or different aspects of ancestral wisdom is what I often talk about and have written an article about recently, is if we bring ancestral wisdom into our business practices and think about those long legacies that we're actually carrying and moving forward within our business and innovation and entrepreneurship. What does that feel like when you're surrounded by these ancient houses that in which our ancestors were literally practicing our law and governance in? If you're in those spaces where that was taking place and unfolding, how does that affect how you feel about your own sense of accountability? Or how does that impact on, another of the principles we talk about a lot is that when you walk into a room, you bring your ancestors with you. So if you're going into that room, that ancestral home and that ancestral space, and you're bringing your ancestors with you, I mean, there's a lot of different learning dynamics that unfold.
Another thing that both Dara and I and many others are working on is part of that indigenization piece, which is creating course materials that are appropriate to teach these topics. We know, for example, we're working on a project on writing business cases from Indigenous perspectives focused on Indigenous organizations, because there is almost no content that has been created that professors can use in responsible ways in their classroom. Most things that are, written about Indigenous communities to be used in business courses are all about, extraction projects, and they see Indigenous people as a side character or a problem or something to be managed. So putting Indigenous people at the center of even, you could argue, the very colonial case study is one way to bring Indigenous perspectives into your course in a way that is very accessible, or should be very accessible, to professors who are, early in their decolonization journey themselves. So seeking out and taking seriously Indigenous scholarship is an important step that any professor can take in any course, no matter what it is.
Okay. You have talked about this perspective as kind of a transversal theme in relation to the principles for responsible management education, right? Because it touches all principles. So what in your opinion would be or could be the implications for the principles for responsible management education? I mean, do we address this idea of decolonizing and indigenizing? Do we sufficiently address it through these principles, or I mean, do we need more?
One thing that we had talked about, Dara and I had talked about, is, coming to the principles. Indigenization and decolonization are a part of all of those things. Dara mentioned, at first it looks like it might fit under, I think it's principle 5, partnerships, because, or that might be the natural place to think of it, because business schools think of themselves as partnering with Indigenous communities. But Dara and I are proof that there are Indigenous business scholars, and our work can contribute to those other 6 principles. So the one that comes to mind is methods. Like Indigenous methods is a whole field, and business schools can pay attention to those methods and take them seriously. So I think, you know, indigenization and decolonization don't fit neatly under the 6 principles, but they can be used in concert. I think to a certain extent, the goals can be aligned there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I know Beedie is a signatory to, you know, so we do some reporting on this. I don't think we've done reporting in the last 2 years. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but yeah, it's hard, I think, to represent what I was just talking about. You know, like could a report on that pedagogical practice of you know, asking students to really rethink their relationship with their ancestors, could that be represented in the report, and what would be the impact or outcome of actually putting that in, other than just, you know, saying we did this? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer this question. Also, it's like, you know, the indigenizing component is quite specific. The language of Indigenous is quite specific to certain countries and certain contexts. It doesn't apply with all countries and contexts either. So yeah, we may be talking more about decolonizing language within the PRME. I'm not sure.
Okay. Also with an eye on the time, and also with an eye on France, by the way, is there something that you want to add to this, France, still?
Maybe one burning question for me specifically when it comes to looking at the principles for responsible management education from a sustainability perspective and long-term sustainability for our planet. What would be a typical example of indigenous knowledge that let's say non-indigenous companies could take on board in trying to tackle sustainability challenges, for instance, environmental sustainability challenge, which they are very much struggling with, especially in the long run? What would be maybe 1 or 2 typical examples of that they could take on board and that they should know?
Well, one of my favorite ways to sort of challenge assumptions is around time. So, you know, when we talk about long-term planning, there's a case study that I bring into the classroom. It's around a Maori Indigenous business, and it's called Wakatu, and I'm happy to provide the link for that. It's available through Sage Publishing, but it's focused on, you know, a Maori tribal entity that then became incorporated and now has, you know, multi-million-dollar businesses. And one of the really wonderful ways of framing that case is they talk about how this tribe is doing 500-year planning. So this is really interesting because a lot of people sort of, you know, go, oh my gosh, like how on earth, you know, what is possible to plan for 500 years? And what I love to bring out in that case is that there's a quote in there that talks about the will of the ancestors, and that it's the 500-year plan that has brought us to where we are now. So who are we to drop the ball? We cannot possibly be the generation to say we don't care about the next 500 years. And that whether or not you feel that you can plan for 500 years is besides the point. You've already missed the point if you're worried about the time frame. The point is, it's our obligation. We owe it to the descendants in 500 years to take care of our resources and to be the custodians that they deserve.
Thank you very much. So I'll close the session now. First of all, I hope everybody's enjoyed this second session as well in this series. And a big thank you to you, Dara and Jordyn, of course, and especially for your for being available early in the morning in your time, right? And I do hope that the PRME community can benefit from your work in the coming years. And since it is so clear that we need new models of management education, including these perspectives, models that are more just, more equitable, that allow for a multiplicity of voices, that basically includes everyone. So thank you very much. Also, thank you for enabling us to share your presentation afterwards. So to the participants, the presentation will be made available. And then the next session in the Prime Education Academy seminar series will be on the 27th of April. And for that session, we've invited Dima Jamali from the University of Sharjah to talk about other cultures of responsible management education and her experiences as a management educator and a business school administrator in the Middle East region, and her vision on the future of management education. And registration for this next session can be done through the Prime website under the tab calendar. So Dara and Jordyn, thanks very much again, and we hope to see everybody again, and have a nice remainder of the day. And bye for now.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
inviting us. Bye.
Bye-bye.